inter-involvement of Hoffa and Marcello was a very close one. For one thing, when Jimmy Hoffa was on trial in Tennessee, and during one of the recesses, Jimmy Hoffa came up to the assistant district attorney, asked about his friend Carlos Marcello, and then asked the assistant district attorney to be sure to remind Carlos Marcello that he had asked for him.
This short documentary peels back two critical layers of organized crime and its creeping entanglement with the American political machine. Specifically, the world the Kennedy family was stepping into by the time the calendar turned to 1960. Robert Kennedy didn't ignite the war on organized crime. He inherited it. But the irony, the brutal irony, was that his own family had long been dining with the devils he would later chase. Organized crime didn't just fall from the sky, it erupted. What gave it life, what turned bootleggers into businessmen and killers into kings, was prohibition. In the 1920s and 1930s, America outlawed more than just liquor. It began cracking down on opium, cocaine, and cannabis. But it was the Prohibition Act's ban on alcohol that detonated the criminal explosion. You could own booze, you could be drunk, but you couldn't sell it. That paradox didn't just create a black market, it built a syndicate. It drew blueprints for an invisible empire, one that would eventually worm its way into every city hall, courthouse, and police precinct in the country. At the time, America wasn't the global superpower it would later become. It was a sleeping capitalist giant in a world dominated by old empires. Britain wore its crown with centuries of arrogance, and America? It both resented and emulated them. It played both ally and assassin. By 1928, the criminal underworld was evolving. Italian, Irish, and Jewish mobs began forging alliances, not just with each other, but with politicians. One of their earliest forays into real power was the presidential election of 1928. Lucky Luciano and his circle threw their weight behind Alfred Smith, the Catholic governor of New York, in his race against Herbert Hoover. They backed Smith hard, but the country wasn't ready. He lost, defeated by his faith, his accent, and his New York roots. For men like Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, and the Pendergast machine out of Kansas City, it was a bitter lesson. Politics wasn't just about bribes. It was about optics. They threw their lot in with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the patrician aristocrat who talked like a king and smiled like a priest. But they misunderstood with what they were dealing. Roosevelt wasn't like the ward bosses and compromised judges they controlled. He was old money. He was war strategy in a dinner jacket. FDR knew the game. If he was going to take the underworld's support, he needed leverage. So, he created chaos. He unleashed reformers like Judge Samuel Seabury to dig into the rot of New York politics. Police corruption, city hall scandals, Tammany Hall's grip. Every morning, Luciano would open the papers and see another one of his rackets exposed. He was furious, but it was too late. Roosevelt had the votes. He had the press. And now, he had the underworld's secrets. Once he had the presidency, Roosevelt didn't need mob money anymore. What he needed, what he always needed, was control. He went to war with the very men who helped get him there. No Democrat would touch them. They were too compromised. So Roosevelt found a Republican, Thomas Dewey, a crusader, a killer with a briefcase. Dewey tore through the underworld. Luciano went to prison. Dutch Schultz was murdered by his own to stop him from killing Dewey. Lepke Buchalter was arrested and sentenced to death. Vito Genovese fled to Italy. Meyer Lansky slipped to Miami and Havana. Bugsy Siegel vanished west to California. Costello headed down to Louisiana. The house was on fire. The Chicago outfit fared no better. After Capone went down for tax evasion, Paul Ricca and others were rounded up. Roosevelt didn't destroy organized crime. He reshaped it. He didn't need their money anymore. He wanted their networks. And behind the scenes, the establishment was already getting ready to play its next hand. When Prohibition ended, the establishment started painting Luciano as someone who had been working with Chinese warlords in Shanghai, smuggling heroin into the United States. While many mobsters saw drug trafficking as an unmanly business, something Luciano agreed with Tom Dewey stated Luciano had no such illusions. Dewey stated Luciano rose fast as a heroin kingpin, and more infamously as a pimp in New York City. And that was enough. Luciano was arrested in 1936 on 62 counts of prostitution. He was sentenced to 35 years of hard time. But in a strange twist of wartime fortune, his criminal associates devised a plan to spring him loose. In 1942, the USS Normandy, a French luxury liner converted into a troop ship, mysteriously caught fire and capsized in the New York harbor. The docks were mob-controlled, and Luciano's people controlled the docks. With U.S. ports on high alert due to fears of Nazi U-boat sabotage, the Navy blamed the fire on German agents, just as Luciano's men had hoped. The Office of Naval Intelligence, embarrassed and desperate, turned to the Luciano Lansky Dockworkers Union for help in securing the harbors. And that's where the deal was made. It was called Operation Underworld, a clandestine agreement between the Navy and the Mafia. What most people don't know, or don't talk about, is that when the ships left for war, they didn't leave New York. They left Louisiana. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers passed through New Orleans, and every one of them, knowingly or not, dropped money into the open palms of Carlos Marcello. His slot machines, jukeboxes, and brothels lined the final stretch of American soil these men would ever see. The war effort became a windfall, but it wasn't just about the profits. Marcello kept the southern docks safe, free of sabotage, strikes, or Nazi interference. While the Office of Naval Intelligence scrambled to secure the East Coast, fascism was never going to land in the South, not under Marcello's watch. And the CIA took notice. His efficiency, his loyalty, his control. For showing that he could run the docks like a general runs a battlefield, Marcello was granted total control of the southern shipping lanes, not just by the Underworld, but by American intelligence itself. In exchange for dock security and aid in the upcoming invasion of Sicily, Luciano would get an early release from prison, followed by deportation to Italy. Luciano's union was given complete control over New York harbor security, ensuring a secure flow of wartime goods and, quietly, narcotics from European and Cuban heroin labs. In 1946, Luciano was released. He was shipped off to Sicily, where he began the work of resurrecting the Sicilian Mafia, which had been nearly wiped out under Mussolini's fascist regime. And one man watched it all unfold from inside the administration, Joseph Kennedy, bootlegger, dealmaker, future ambassador. He saw how Roosevelt danced with the Mafia, used them, then torched them. FDR became the very thing Kennedy had always wanted to be, a populist president, beloved and feared. But Joe Kennedy's flirtations with fascism, his open admiration for Nazi Germany, sealed his fate. His dream of the White House died in a cloud of suspicion and scandal. So, he recalculated. If he couldn't sit behind the resolute desk himself, he'd send his sons. Before it was the CIA, it was the Office of Strategic Services, and before it became the dark brain of empire, it was just a handful of spy masters, gamblers, and dreamers pulling strings in the shadows of a world war. They needed ports secured, strikes averted, and Sicily cracked open like a rotten walnut. They turned to Luciano, locked away in Dannemora, and struck a deal. Help us win the war, and we'll give you your life back. He delivered, and the OSS evolved. By the time the Cold War began to burn through continents, The newly baptized Central Intelligence Agency wasn't just cooperating with organized crime. They were merging with it, covertly, surgically, and with chilling precision. They had nations to flip, elections to rig, coups to orchestrate. And they needed untraceable money. Money that didn't come with Senate hearings or congressional budgets. They needed narcotics. And they got them. The pipeline was global. Heroin moved like crude oil, extracted in the Golden Triangle, refined in Turkey, processed in Marseille, and delivered to the veins of Harlem, Newark, New Orleans. When the old colonial empires crumbled, France, Britain, the Dutch, the Americans didn't mourn. They slipped into the vacuum and inherited their shadows. Luciano denied he had anything to do with it. He claimed he tried to shut it down, even offered his services to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in exchange for his citizenship. He said he was framed, discredited, hunted by the very men who had once used him to win a war. But even he admitted this much. There are people in the government who need this racket to keep going. And he was right. Behind the curtain, heroin was black money. Untaxed, untraceable, and bottomless. And the real architects of this machinery weren't the gangsters. They were the intelligence officers, the men in suits who never needed to carry guns because they carried clearance. The heroin wasn't just funding mob bosses, it was funding American empire. And it all began in earnest with one forgotten figure, Colonel Paul Helliwell. He wasn't famous. You won't find statues. No spy novels bearing his name. But Helliwell changed the future of US intelligence in ways that even Wild Bill Donovan, Allen Dulles, and James Jesus Angleton would quietly respect. In China, 1943, the world was on fire. The Japanese had invaded. Mao Zedong's Communist Army was fighting a brutal civil war with Chiang Kai-shek's KMT nationalists, even as both sides fought the invaders. On paper, they were allies. In reality, it was a knife fight in the dark. Helliwell, a cold operator with OSS credentials, embedded himself in the southern province of Yunnan, where the truth was impossible to ignore. Chiang's army was surviving, barely, not because of Western aid or military brilliance, but because they were dealing heroin like it was military-grade currency. Chiang Kai-shek had done what few dared to admit. He'd turned nationalist China into a narco-state. Through the Green Gang, a Shanghai-based criminal syndicate, Chiang had organized the fractured opium trade under his own command. The Green Gang had been around since before Prohibition, smuggling opium, rigging elections, building secret tunnels through the underbelly of Shanghai. They backed Chiang's rise to power, and in return he gave them the keys to the treasury. The heroin flowed through the Burma Road and out into the world. The Rockefellers, under the guise of medical aid, had already helped legitimize opium shipments through the China Medical Board in 1910. But now it wasn't just shipping, it was funding a war. Helliwell saw the structure, he saw the desperation, and he pitched an idea. What if the OSS helped facilitate the opium trade? What if America's anti-communist allies were allowed, encouraged, to sell drugs in exchange for US protection and logistical support? It would guarantee a cash flow. It would help crush Mao. It would keep Asia in play. Donovan signed off. Dulles nodded. Angleton watched from the corner like a ghost. It worked, and it became policy. The arrangement was formalized into something called Civil Air Transport Nationalist-Run Airline, that later evolved into the CIA's infamous covert carrier, Air America. These weren't just planes. These were flying banks, flying arsenals, flying heroin labs. And that was just the beginning. Because once heroin started paying for anti-communist wars, it never stopped. The system grew, tentacles stretching through New Orleans, where Carlos Marcello controlled the docks, through Sicily, where mafia dons still honored their wartime pacts, through Turkey, Marseille, Vietnam, and eventually Central and South America. By the time Eisenhower was in office, The CIA had established a global shadow economy fueled by drugs, weapons, and regime change. And as America's star rose, so did its secrets. The narcotics network wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a covert economy. The product moved like oil, only more profitable. Raw opium from the Golden Triangle, cooked in Turkey, processed in Marseille, shipped out to Harlem, New Jersey, New Orleans. And standing at the crossroads of it all was Carlos Marcello. He wasn't just another boss. He was a logistical warlord. He controlled the docks. He controlled the unions. He controlled every ship that came in and out of Louisiana. And unlike the New York Dons, he didn't hide behind some Italian restaurant or a slot machine front. He had a lobbying firm in Washington, legit, on paper. Senators called him back. Foreign leaders booked appointments through his people. When the CIA needed coups in Guatemala or the Dominican Republic, when they needed weapons moved, or rebels armed, or messages delivered off the books, they called the man who could get things done without a paper trail. They called Marcello. But don't blame Eisenhower. Don't even blame Kennedy. This started with Harry Truman. The man from Missouri walked into the White House in Roosevelt's shadow, but he brought with him the ghosts of the Pendergast machine, a Kansas City syndicate with roots in political corruption, racketeering, and union payoffs. He knew the streets. He knew the silence that came with certain favors. So, when OSS veterans like Wild Bill Donovan, Alan Dulles, and James Jesus Angleton wanted to create a post-war spy agency, it was Truman who shut it down. I don't want an American Gestapo. That's what he called it. And yet somehow, in 1947, the CIA was born. But before they had a black budget, before Langley became the beating heart of shadow operations, they had opium. And the man with the plan, Paul Helliwell, a colonel in the OSS, a ghost in the system. He had watched Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army fund their fight against Mao with opium, moving it through the Green Gang in Shanghai, washing it clean with Western medical cover, and cashing it into weapons and payrolls. Helliwell didn't just observe the system. He refined it. He pitched the idea. Use heroin to fund black ops. The CIA didn't need congressional funding. They needed deniability. And nothing was more invisible than dope money. No receipts, no oversight, no paper trail. Donovan and Dulles didn't blink. They approved the operation and greenlit Civil Air Transport, a fake airline built to move heroin out of Southeast Asia under the camouflage of anti-communist logistics. The drugs kept flowing. The money kept coming. And then came Marcello, America's southern connection to the Mexican cartels, the Dominican traffickers, the Caribbean and Cuban docks. During World War II, when the ports were locked down against Nazi submarines, heroin dried up across the country. What little still got in came through Mexico, and the men who controlled that border answered to Jack Dragner, Paul Ricca, and Carlos Marcello. He wasn't a dealer. He was the gate. And when the war ended, the CIA took notice. They didn't just let him operate. They needed him to operate. Because by the time Truman was gone and Kennedy had taken the stage, the machine was fully built. Opium had become the oil that greased the gears of shadow power. The CIA used it to fund Operation Gladio in Europe, to arm fascist cells in Italy, to destabilize social democracies in Greece and France, and to wage an ideological war against socialism, anti-colonialism, and anyone who dared threaten American capital. The CIA, the Mafia, and the right-wing paramilitaries of the Cold War had one thing in common. They were allergic to communism. They were devoted to capital. They were addicted to heroin. And when the heroin ran out, they made more. In 1945, the war was over, but not for everyone. America's ports were quiet, the guns were silent, but something else was stirring in the shadows. Heroin, scarce, expensive, nearly extinct. Only a select few still used it, mainly in Harlem, where a jazz renaissance was in full swing. In the smoky clubs of New York, among the bass lines and trumpet solos, heroin had become fashionable. It wasn't just a drug, it was a statement. A hit cost nearly $100, and that price tag made it seductive. Paul Helliwell, a wartime intelligence officer turned Cold War architect, understood the economics. From his time with the Office of Strategic Services in China, he'd seen how heroin could bankroll armies. And now, in post-war America, he saw something just as dangerous. A market desperate for product, and a government unwilling to fund the covert operations needed to win the next war. So, he designed a plan. He called it Operation X. Helliwell brought it to Alan Dulles, Wild Bill Donovan, and James Jesus Angleton. The premise was simple: fund the emerging CIA with untraceable money, bypassing Congress entirely. How? By facilitating and protecting the global heroin trade, warlords, mobsters, and corrupt officials to build a narcotics empire that would run parallel to the legitimate state. The test market, Harlem, the launch point, the jazz scene. And in the underworld, there was one man who had both the reach and the resources to pull it off. Meyer Lansky, the accountant of the mob, a financier, a syndicate builder. But while Lansky ran the numbers, it was Carlos Marcello who ran the ports. He wasn't just another boss. He was a logistics mastermind. He controlled the docks in New Orleans, and more importantly, he controlled the corridors between the US, Cuba, and Central America. Helliwell and Lansky created a front, a shell company called the General Development Corporation, based in Miami. Through it, dirty cash would be cleaned, profits would be hidden, and operations would be protected. The heroin itself. That came from the plateaus of Indochina, cultivated by nationalist Chinese and Thai warlords the OSS had backed during the war. From there, it moved across Central Asia, cutting through Afghanistan, a country that, decades later, would become the heroin capital of the world under CIA supervision. The raw opium was processed in Sicilian labs, in facilities once operated by Schiaparelli, a legitimate pharmaceutical company with deep ties to organized crime. These labs had been rebuilt with help from Silver Dollar Sam, the New Orleans kingpin who had recently been deported back to Sicily. Sam's people turned powder into profit. The heroin was pure, potent, and ready for market. From Sicily it was smuggled in through fake wax oranges and sardine cans, hidden among shipping manifests and diplomatic cargo. The shipments landed in Cuba, where Santo Traficante, Marcello's southern counterpart, ran the mob's Cuban labs. There the heroin was cut with sugar, repackaged, and moved discreetly to New York and New Orleans. Traficante's Cuba became the linchpin, until Fidel Castro took the island in the 1950s and booted the mob into exile, triggering an even tighter alliance between the CIA and organized crime. Once in the US, the heroin spread through African-American jazz clubs, from Harlem to New Orleans, targeting musicians and club patrons, feeding addiction, and fueling a black market that exploded in silence. The Teamsters, under Jimmy Hoffa, moved the product across the South and the Midwest in trucks that no one dared inspect. And while the jazz clubs burned through the product, the profits flowed backward, into shell companies, into banks, into Miami. The General Development Corporation became a laundering machine. Marcello's cut, sent overseas, funneled to the Sicilian Mafia, where the old world dons distributed the money through a hidden underground network of right-wing militias and paramilitary groups. That network had a name: Gladio. By the end of the 1940s, Carlos Marcello wasn't just a mob boss, he was a kingmaker. He controlled the ports, he bankrolled the deep state, and he helped build a secret global infrastructure that kept the CIA operating in the shadows. No oversight, no budget hearings, just heroin, hidden hands, and a pipeline of power that stretched from the nightclubs of New Orleans to Harlem to the back alleys of Palermo. And no one in Washington dared ask where the money was coming from. He arrived in New Orleans like a ghost with a badge, quiet, relentless, alone. Aaron Kohn wasn't a Fed or a cop. He didn't carry a gun. What he had was a worse clipboard, a Rolodex of informants, and a burning need to dismantle the biggest criminal empire in the South. Around 1954, he came hunting for answers. By 1955, he realized the problem wasn't just crime. It was power. Carlos Marcello didn't run his operation with bullets. He ran it with handshakes. New York had political cover. Chicago ruled with fear. But in Louisiana, Marcello built something else entirely. He didn't need to intimidate the police. He made them shareholders. Sheriffs, police chiefs, judges, city councilmen, even senators were cut in like silent partners in a Fortune 500 company. They weren't just bribed. They were invested. If a sheriff let the numbers roll, he got a cut. If a police chief looked the other way on a heroin run, his bank account smiled. These weren't bribes. These were dividends. Marcello understood something other mob bosses didn't. If you wanted protection, don't trust the mob. Trust the man in the uniform. Get him a slice, and he'll guard your money better than any goon could. That's how armored trucks were born, not by banks, by the mob. They needed a way to move mountains of cash from casinos to banks without being ripped off by rival crews or rogue gangsters. The solution? Convert police SWAT trucks into mobile vaults. Local departments played along, because every time a truck rolled, so did their payday. Marcello didn't just own the streets. He owned the institutions that were supposed to stop him. And then came Kohn. He started digging into the rot. He mapped out the spiderweb, traced the connections. Every thread led back to Carlos. But Marcello wasn't some flashy kingpin. He didn't posture. He didn't gloat. He watched. And when Kohn got too close, he struck back cold and quiet. Kohn refused to play ball. He wouldn't name informants. Wouldn't they break their trust? That trust was his only shield, in a city where trust could get you buried. So Marcello used the very system Kohn was trying to clean up and turned it against him. He got Kohn locked up. By early 1955, the headlines told the story. Crime investigator must serve 10 days for contempt. Jailed for protecting informants. First man to go to jail after $80,000 probe is the investigator. While Marcello's men walked free, cops on the take, gamblers bribing majors, judges pocketing envelopes, Aaron Kohn was sitting in a cold cell in Orleans Parish Prison. His crime? Silence. He wouldn't name names, not to the grand jury, not to the judge, not even when the Louisiana Supreme Court told him he had no legal right to promise confidentiality. Still, he didn't flinch. He shook hands with the men who believed in him, Councilman Moore, former grand jury foreman Morgan Whitney, Dudley Foley, and went inside. Marcello had outmaneuvered him. Even the man who had sentenced Kohn, Judge Bernard Koch, was following a playbook that had nothing to do with justice. Kohn's allies tried everything. Appeals to the governor, to the state Supreme Court, even talk of petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court. Nothing worked. But Kohn didn't crack. He told the press, "There is still work I can do in jail, as long as they let me have pen and paper." He spent those 10 days writing, documenting, watching, because even in jail he was still fighting, still building a case against the man who had turned New Orleans into his own private kingdom. And outside those jail walls, Carlos Marcello sat in silence. The real king, untouched, protected by a web of loyalty, money, and fear. Aaron Kohn was the first man to draw blood from that empire, but he paid for it. By 1955, Aaron Kohn was no longer just an investigator. He had become a symbol. A man without a badge or a pistol, going up against a criminal government that didn't wear ski masks or hide in shadows. They wore robes, uniforms, and tailored suits. Their empire had no borders. It lived in city councils, parish courts, police headquarters, and banquet halls. And its boss was Carlos Marcello. Marcello was no screamer. He didn't rant, didn't rave. He built alliances the way oilmen drill for crude, deep, quiet, and permanent. His genius was simple. He cut the local sheriff in on the rackets, gave the police chief a percentage of the take. He let the judges, clerks, and senators wet their beaks on the numbers, narcotics, casinos, and every dirty dollar that changed hands in Louisiana. He didn't buy them. He partnered with them. Aaron Kohn saw it all and made the mistake of trying to tear it down. He came from the FBI world, where procedure and protocol were armor. But in New Orleans, those things were tissue paper. He ran the Metropolitan Crime Commission like a wartime intelligence unit. His desk was stacked with leads on crooked judges, fixed fights, and politicians pulling strings for gangsters. His list of confidential informants read like a roadmap to Marcello's empire. Then came the subpoena. The grand jury wanted the names. They wanted his sources. And Kohn said no. He went to jail for it. In January 1955, he was sentenced to 10 days in Orleans Parish Prison by Judge Bernard Koch. 10 days for contempt, because he wouldn't betray the people risking their lives to speak out. The city had spent $80,000 on his investigation, and the only person who ended up behind bars was the investigator. It was a farce, but it sent a message. The people didn't forget. When Kohn walked out of that jail cell on Sunday, April 3rd, he was greeted not with disgrace, but with applause. Dr. J. Gray of the First Baptist Church threw a banquet in his honor. Civic leaders handed him a certificate of appreciation. He hadn't lost. He'd been baptized in the corruption he swore to expose. He gave speeches. His first outside New Orleans was to the Hammond Lions Club, where he laid it out plain. Half the kids getting arrested for burglary were under 18. Juvenile crime was on the rise. Syndicated crime was entrenched. The solution, he said, wasn't violence. It was intelligent voting. But Kohn's war wasn't over. That summer in July, millionaire sportsman and boxing promoter Blaise D'Antoni, a man with deep ties to New York's Frank Costello and Frankie Carbo, launched a public crusade to destroy Kohn's credibility. At a civic meeting, D'Antoni exploded. He accused Kohn of hypocrisy, threatened to run him out of town, and called him a disgrace to the city. "You ever look in your own closet?" D'Antoni sneered. "I'm gonna be on you like gravy on rice." Kohn didn't blink. He fired back questions of his own, about Costello, about Carbo, about D'Antoni's boxing enterprise and its real owners. The answers were telling. D'Antoni admitted he'd known Costello for many, many years. A friend called him. Admitted Carbo worked public relations at Lincoln Beach, a waterfront amusement park D'Antoni owned. But the heat was too much. Just weeks later, D'Antoni pulled the plug on his entire boxing venture, Louisiana Boxing Enterprises, citing unfair criticism and scoffing lies. He blamed Kohn and Assistant Police Superintendent Guy Bannister, the same Bannister who had once been FBI, the same Bannister who later, in a darker chapter of American history, would become a figure tangled in the shadows of Dallas, 1963. Kohn, meanwhile, was being hailed as a martyr across the country. In New York, another crime fighter, William Keating, was jailed for the same crime, refusing to name informants. As Keating was released, Kohn stood beside him at a luncheon. Reporters compared them. Both men had chosen jail over betrayal. Both had drawn the line where conscience began. A telegram from Senator Estes Kefauver was read aloud. The Senate Judiciary Committee was drafting legislation to protect crime fighters who guarded their sources. They called Kohn another Bill Keating. But really, it was the other way around. Aaron Kohn was first. By the summer of 1955, Aaron Kohn had already worn the steel cuffs once, and now he was staring down the barrel of a second prison term. Not for theft, not for violence, but for silence. The case was simple on paper, but behind the court transcripts, it was a war. 2 New Orleans cops, Lieutenant Lewis Hill and former Sergeant Clifford Ruther, were standing trial for public bribery. The state alleged the two had compiled a document, a damning ledger of kickbacks and payoffs connected to a sprawling gambling network in the city. It was Kohn who held the document, and it was Kohn who refused to say where he got it. He took the stand like a man walking through fire. Hill's attorney, Richard A. Dowling, leaned forward with the question everyone had been waiting for. "Who gave you the document?" Kohn didn't flinch. "I'm sorry, I can't answer that." He had made a promise to a New Orleans police officer who had handed him that evidence in secret back on August 31st, 1953. That officer feared for his life, and Kohn had pledged silence. Breaking it meant burning a bridge that gave others the courage to come forward. Judge Niels F. Hertz gave Kohn a window, what he called a period of grace. If he named the source before the end of testimony, the contempt charge would be dropped. But Kohn didn't budge. Days later, the jury acquitted Hill and Ruther. 1 hour and 45 minutes of deliberation, and it was over. The case was gone, but Kohn's punishment was not. August 5th, 1955. For the second time that year, Aaron Kohn was sentenced to 10 days in Orleans Parish Prison. He was fined $100 and branded in open court, again, as a man in contempt. Judge Hertz said the document was the most important piece of evidence in the case. Kohn disagreed. He told the court that the officer who gave it to him couldn't verify any handwriting on it. To him, it wasn't material. But it didn't matter. The judge saw defiance, and he ruled accordingly. Kohn had until Friday to appeal to the Louisiana Supreme Court. If the court didn't intervene, the man who helped bring a city's corruption into daylight would go back into the shadows of a prison cell. The press had a field day. "Crime prober faces jail term again," blared the headlines. But the people who understood what was happening, the ones who knew New Orleans was wired like a mob-run city-state, they saw a different story. Kohn was a man being punished for keeping his word. He was the only person jailed during a massive investigation into city corruption, while the racketeers, dirty cops, and fixers walked free with smirks and suspended sentences. Editorials compared him to the man of the moment in New York, William J. Keating, jailed for refusing to disclose sources in a wiretap scandal. Both were now being hailed as symbols of integrity in a country struggling to define justice. One newspaper, the Hammond Vindicator, summed it up best. "Aaron Kohn down New Orleans way reminds me of the old adage about the railroad man, again and again. This is a case where a man was doing his duty, securing valuable information that aided him in the task, then jailed for not telling where he secured it." But Kohn was already moving on. Just a month later, in September 1955, he stood before the public and declared that New Orleans' $10 million a year lottery racket had been smashed. For weeks, not a single vendor had been arrested. That was the point. The racket wasn't just broken, it was evaporated. He didn't need a badge to do what the police wouldn't. Marcello's network had taken a hit. But like all great empires, it didn't fall in one blow. It fell piece by piece at the hands of men like Kohn, men willing to sit in a jail cell rather than trade honor for convenience. And while the rest of the country moved on, Aaron Kohn stayed behind, still grinding, still watching, still fighting ghosts. By November 1955, the man they couldn't silence was back on the streets, and back on the stage. Aaron Kohn, just weeks out of his second stint in parish prison, didn't hide. He didn't retreat. He doubled down. He was now a guest speaker on the civic circuit, headlining supper clubs and church halls with the same conviction that got him jailed, twice. On November 9th, in the Education Building on East Charles Street, Kohn was scheduled to address the Methodist Men's Club. On the flyer, he was introduced simply Managing Director, Metropolitan Crime Commission. But behind the title was a resume that read like a dossier for a wartime operative. He'd served as a special agent under J. Edgar Hoover, supervised crime lab work for the FBI, investigated rackets in Chicago, and helped crush police corruption in New Orleans. By now he was known not just as a crime fighter, but as the only man ever locked up in New Orleans for refusing to betray confidential sources. Twice. To the people in that room, he was more than a guest speaker. He was living proof of what the system did to men who told the truth. While Kohn was still rattling the pillars in Louisiana, the rest of the country was waking up. That same week in Miami, Senator Estes Kefauver opened a new round of Senate hearings, this time not on gambling or political rackets, but something even uglier, the interstate sale of babies. It was a new battlefield in the same war: corruption, exploitation, power without consequence. In Georgia, judges were pulling children from poor mothers and selling them for fees, dressed up as legal costs. In Kansas, newspapers had exposed the trafficking of infants across state lines like livestock. In Alabama, John Patterson, whose father had been gunned down in the cleanup of Phoenix City, testified with fire in his voice, "We paid a terrible price for a clean city. I'm sure you wouldn't want to pay the same." The courtroom smelled like cigarette ash and cold coffee. The chairs creaked. The reporters scribbled. A single spotlight, the weight of Washington, was focused not on a gangster, not on a corrupt mayor or a crooked union boss, but on a juvenile court judge from Augusta, Georgia, Harry Woodward. He didn't walk in like a man ashamed. He took his seat like a man used to being obeyed. And as the subcommittee on juvenile delinquency assembled in Miami that November morning in 1955, the horror show that followed felt less like a crime hearing and more like the unraveling of a Southern Gothic nightmare. The man who led the charge was Ernest Mittler, a former New York City prosecutor, the kind who cut his teeth hunting baby brokers and illegal adoption rings in Manhattan's tenement shadows. Now he was standing in a federal courtroom, reading aloud stories that sounded like something out of a paperback pulp novel, except they were real. The court heard babies sold like livestock, of mothers, often poor and defenseless, dragged into Woodward's juvenile court under charges of neglect or immorality. Their rights terminated in the time it took to sign a few papers. The children disappeared, reassigned, exported, placed for adoption with couples from California, New York, Florida, and every state in between. The judge charged fees for each placement, sometimes $100, sometimes $300, always in cash, sometimes as a judge, sometimes brazenly as a private attorney, using his own signature on the same paperwork he'd just presided over. One child, Mittler said, was taken from a mother for excessive drinking, then placed with an alcoholic who ran a seedy motel. Another woman had 4 children ripped from her custody after accusations of immorality. A Miami couple, driving through Augusta, met with Woodward, handed him $250, and drove away with a child that same day. Even in a nation numbed by scandal, this was stunning. To shield his sources, the first witness was placed behind a screen. He was a Miami attorney who testified anonymously, out of fear that the adoptive couple he represented would be targeted. He confirmed the story. His clients had received a child through Judge Woodward's court. The paperwork was clean. The transaction disturbingly smooth. Then came the local voices. Mrs. Dessa Epps, a tiny woman with a thick Georgia accent and iron in her spine. She ran a boarding home for juvenile wards from 1940 to 1951 and saw the whole operation from the inside. She told the panel exactly what happened, how the system worked, how no one ever stopped it. Woodward's attorneys were in the audience too. W.P. Congdon and Roy Harris, the latter a long-time Georgia political power broker, rose and demanded the right to cross-examine. Kefauver, calm as ever, gave them the green light. But Harris only asked a few brief questions. Almost symbolic. Almost scripted. Mrs. Mertis Heydrich, a volunteer in the juvenile court, followed. She testified that the chief probation officer once paid her $5 to pose as the mother of a child being shipped off for adoption. That wasn't a bribe. That was procedure. All of it, the courtroom theater, the whispered bribes, the systemic rot, spoke to something deeper, something bigger. This wasn't just a local judge gone rogue. This was a baby mill, operating under the color of law, feeding children into a black market system that crossed state lines and enriched the very people meant to protect the vulnerable. Mittler didn't mince words. He said, "There is a need for a federal law making it a crime to place children for adoption across state lines for compensation." And for once, even the politicians didn't argue. Senator Estes Kefauver, who had once stared down the mafia in smoke-filled hearings and taken on the national bookie wire, now stood in the same courtroom chasing a different kind of syndicate legal one hiding in courthouses and cashing in on children. He called it a national disgrace. And he was right. Because while America worried about gangsters in silk suits and heroin in Harlem, the real crime, the one no one wanted to believe, was happening in juvenile courts, in plain daylight, under the authority of the bench. Kohn was watching it all closely. These weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of the same disease. A government apparatus asleep at the wheel, or worse, taking payoffs to keep their eyes closed. Kefauver, ever the crusader, called for federal legislation to stop the black market sale of children. But he also returned to an old theme, the one that had launched his career 5 years earlier in that same courtroom. Crime commissions. He called them one of the best ways to keep cities clean. He praised men like Kohn without naming them. Men who didn't need badges or search warrants. Men who didn't wait for orders from Washington. Men who walked into the dirtiest corners of American life and said, "Enough." Kohn knew this game. He knew that winning meant more than raids and headlines. It meant stamina. It meant surviving the blowback, the smear jobs, the death threats, and the courtrooms where judges wore robes but played for the other team. So, he kept going. One supper club, one civic hall, one quiet conversation at a time. He had been called a martyr, a nuisance, a fool, a hero. But in the end, he was something else entirely. He was the man who wouldn't break. By the 1950s, the handshake deals made in wartime backrooms had evolved into something far more durable. Long-term contracts. The men who once answered the call of patriotism were now just answering the phone, and many of them weren't in the government at all. The CIA, Naval Intelligence, the Pentagon. They had all become too comfortable with the devils they made deals with. Men who answered to no law but their own. Men like Carlos Marcello. It was 1951 when Senator Estes Kefauver tried to rip the lid off. He dragged gangsters into the spotlight, gave them no place to hide. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the rot didn't stop at the mob. It was in the Capitol. It was in the Pentagon. It was in Langley. There were whispers, threats. The knives didn't always come out in the open. Sometimes they came in the form of favors revoked. Votes mysteriously lost. Friendly phone calls from unfriendly voices. Kefauver failed. But time was on the side of the truth. And the truth was this: the CIA didn't start with secrets. It started with favors. And by the time the Cold War was in full swing, those favors were being paid with heroin. 2 years after Aaron Kohn first drew blood from the New Orleans underworld, the storm finally broke. The alarms he and others like him had sounded, the warnings of a syndicate more powerful than any single government office, were no longer theory. They were fact. 1957 was the reckoning. Frank Costello was shot in the head. The bullet barely missed his brain. It grazed him, ripped past his temple, and lodged into history. He survived, but the message was clear. A war was coming. The old guard, Luciano's men, the architects of the modern syndicate, were either dead or exiled. Willie Moretti was gone. Joe Adonis had been deported. Frank Scalise murdered. Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, butchered in a hotel barber's chair. That year, sit-downs were held across the country like wartime summits. One of them was set at Ritchie, the Boot Boiardo's estate, infamous for its bloody reputation. But Boiardo's backyard wasn't the right place for diplomacy. It was known for executions, not alliances. Luciano's empire was collapsing in real time. Genovese was moving in. And Gambino, quiet, calculating, invisible even in daylight, was waiting. The Anastasia family needed a new boss, and Carlo was the man everyone thought they could control. But the truth was, Gambino had already made his move. Only one family in America had the age, the respect, and the old world weight to convene the commission in crisis. The Buffalo family, Joe Barbara in Apalachin, Stefano Magaddino pulling strings in the shadows, and one man at the center of it all, known only to a few, but respected by everyone. Russell Bufalino. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Luciano respected him. Anastasia had trusted him. Jimmy Blue Eyes called him a brother. Sam Giancana had known him since the early 1940s, and the Chicago outfit respected few outside their own. Bufalino was connected to everyone, and in 1957 he helped organize what would become the most infamous mob summit in American history. Apalachin. They thought it would be discreet, a sleepy town, a house in the woods, no press, no cops, just limousines rolling in one by one, men in silk suits and black Cadillacs whispering about succession, expansion, control. But someone was watching. A local officer noticed the influx of cars, the unfamiliar faces, and the nervous energy in the air. Within hours, the meeting was raided. The story exploded across the headlines. America's silent fear that a shadow government of gangsters was operating under the surface was confirmed. The public lost its mind. The Kefauver Committee, long dormant, began to stir. Men who had tasted blood in the early 50s were suddenly back in the saddle, hungrier, meaner, better equipped. And this time, there were new names at the table. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. The brothers didn't just step into the spotlight. They owned it. Just like Roosevelt 2 decades earlier, they had the wind at their backs and a mission in their veins. But unlike FDR, who manipulated the Mafia in secret and destroyed them quietly, the Kennedys came in swinging. They wanted exposure. They wanted confession. They wanted organized crime crucified in front of the American people. And they almost did it. Luciano, sitting in exile in Sicily, fumed at what Genovese had done. He had warned them about drawing too much heat, about arrogance, about ambition without foresight. Now the commission was fractured, and America's government was circling like sharks. Luciano began plotting Genovese's downfall alongside Frank Costello, Gambino, and others still loyal to the old structure. By 1959, Genovese would be in prison, his empire gutted from within. But the wounds went deeper. Men like Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante knew exactly how Gambino came to power. They never forgot it, and they never fully trusted him. And as the Kennedys pushed harder, the Mafia found itself not just under siege from Capitol Hill, but from a changing world. Cuba was slipping away. Fidel Castro had come down from the hills and seized Havana by force. The casinos, the racetracks, the backdoor deals with the Central Intelligence Agency, all of it was crumbling. Organized crime had used Havana as a transit hub for narcotics, a money laundering paradise, and a pressure valve for intelligence activity. Now, it was gone. Nixon met Castro and misread him completely. Thought he was just a soldier, not a statesman. The mob would never forgive Nixon for that mistake. Behind closed doors, industrialists and syndicate figures began pushing the Eisenhower administration. They wanted a full-blown invasion of Cuba, or a bullet in Castro's brain. Multiple CIA operations were launched. One went through Robert Maheu in Las Vegas, who connected the agency to Sam Giancana and Russell Bufalino. Another operation reached Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante directly, urging them to begin laying the groundwork for what would become the Bay of Pigs. Each plot had its own funding, its own operatives, its own promises of secrecy. By then, the CIA had been working hand in glove with organized crime for over a decade. They weren't just allies. They were co-architects of the modern American underworld. Kennedy didn't know how deep it went. During the McClellan hearings, he thought he was chasing union shakedowns and rigged construction bids. What he didn't realize was that many of the men he was grilling weren't just mob bosses. They were assets. They had clearance. They had value. They were useful. But Kennedy didn't care. He wanted them exposed, publicly. He didn't take his father's advice. He didn't do it the Roosevelt way. Roosevelt made his moves in the dark. He gave the mob a seat at the table, then flipped it when no one was looking. The Kennedys did the opposite. They dragged it into the light. John Kennedy walked into the White House and told J. Edgar Hoover to his face, "Organized crime exists, and I'm going to prove it." And he did. In 2 years, the empire that had lived in whispers and backroom deals was laid bare, and from that moment forward, anyone with money, power, or influence learned the new rule. If you ever found yourself in a room with these men, walk out. Don't shake their hand. Don't ask their name. Don't let them touch you. This was a new war, a war unlike anything America had seen before. And it didn't just change organized crime, it changed the world. In the year 1958, Aaron Kohn came to visit Bobby Kennedy. And what he had to say would pull the young attorney into a world of secrets, violence, and betrayal that stretched from the White House to Havana, and would shape the rest of his life. It was around this time, as the McClellan hearings began to heat up, that Robert Kennedy first realized the scale of the threat he was facing. Organized crime wasn't just a street-level menace. It was a shadow government. And the deeper he dug, the more the ground shook beneath his feet. He didn't yet know just how far the roots went, how high the rot reached, or that taking it on would cost both him and his brother everything. But the reckoning began the moment Aaron Kohn knocked on Kennedy's door, shook his hand, and pulled him into a war that stretched far beyond the Mafia. It was a war against Marcello's men, against the Central Intelligence Agency, against a clandestine network that had been quietly weaving itself through the veins of America long before the Kennedys ever took the stage. And the revelations that would follow, once buried in sealed files and whispered only in back rooms, would change history forever. Aaron Kohn went on to testify before the McClellan Committee, and when he spoke, it was with the precision of a scalpel and the fury of a man who had lived too long in the shadow of corruption. He tore into Carlos Marcello's empire, piece by piece, racket by racket, narcotics, prostitution, casinos, political protection. He named the officers, the sheriffs, the councilmen, the senators, the judges. He peeled back the curtain on an invisible kingdom, run not from a capital, but from a back room in Louisiana. And it didn't stop at Marcello. Kohn traced the threads from Arkansas to New York, detailing the interconnected web of syndicates, trafficking routes, and silent partnerships. He named the Trafficante crime family. He laid bare the Southern Mafia, an empire Robert Kennedy hadn't even known existed until Aaron Kohn put it in his lap. Kohn's years of research shattered the myth of Marcello as just another regional boss. He painted him as a national threat, too powerful to ignore, too entrenched to touch. But Robert Kennedy wasn't interested in limits. When he became Attorney General, one of his first phone calls was to Aaron Kohn. "I'm going to deport him," Kennedy said. Kohn scoffed. He had spent too long watching Marcello move untouched through halls of power. But in a snap, just like that, Robert Kennedy had Carlos Marcello picked up and deported to Guatemala. And then came November 22nd, 1963. Aaron Kohn was in court when the judge announced that President Kennedy had been assassinated. He looked to his left, at Carlos Marcello, and what he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. Marcello wasn't shocked, he wasn't grieving, he wasn't even surprised. His expression, Kohn would later recall, was calm, as if he had been waiting for the news, as if he already knew.